Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, this morning. It has been 7 years since the African Union decided on these institutional reforms. As members of civil society, there has been varying degrees or levels of engagement with the process, but for the most part, with this process having been ongoing for some time now, counting 7 years, we believe that it is better late than never. We understand that there may be consequences for the work that we do before the African human rights system, but our response as civil society has been fragmented and ad hoc at best. The lack of coherent and consistent information about what these reforms are has impacted on our ability to respond as civil society. So yes, we do have an agenda for calling you here today because we want to do 4 things with you having joined us. We have created a space with our partners that we are going to mention at the end of this webinar to inform, to provoke a response from civil society, to co-create what our response should be, and more importantly, to ask you to give us gifts of how we take this conversation forward. So, we do need to have a shared understanding of what these reforms are, what they are, why they were started, and where we are in the process. We also need to understand the actors and their interests, which may be different from the origins of these reforms. And as I have mentioned, to understand the implications for the work that we do in the African human rights system. Over the past 5 years, there have been a number of worrying developments in the African human rights system. We need to interrogate or link how this process has been linked to the other developments regarding or relating to the accountability mechanism. So that is the information. We have created this webinar as a learning space where we need to have answers to all of these questions so that however we decide to move from here, we are moving from a place of understanding and a place that's informed so that whatever we create as a response to what we would have learned today is actually based on a well-documented need and understanding of what is at stake. Civil society has an important role to play. And as mentioned earlier, there are various ways in which some people have been consulted and other people who are completely in the dark about what the process is about, and also whether there is any role for civil society at all. Also, as civil society, I think from the information that we hear, we need to take responsibility for our own complicity and complacency in how we have responded to the process and how we have allowed it to unfold in the way that we have. 7 years is a very long time for people who are users of the system to not have had a conversation like this, or even if we have had a conversation like this, to not have put together a coherent plan about how we respond to something that is so important and fundamental to the work that we do. We have to talk about how we have underutilized existing spaces that are meant and should be used to advance progressive causes, such as this one. Key to this, it's the understanding about how the way we continue to engage as actors has really been depoliticized. there is a disconnect between the work that is happening in Addis at the AU level and the work that we do, whether in Banjul or Arusha, when we engage with the mechanisms. And so this disconnect has robbed us of the ability to do the advocacy between the commission, the committee, and the court with the knowledge of what is happening at the African Union. And so we are attempting by convening today to close the gap and to also make urgent the need for the conversation in Addis to inform the activities that we do when we say we are civil society that's acting or working before these three accountability mechanisms. When we have understood this and have done some soul searching, what we are hoping for is that we collectively imagine how we can co-create a better place for ourselves now as part of the response, but more importantly, that in whatever emerges from this process, that there is a better place for people who want to use the accountability mechanisms, whether the various victims of human rights violations, whether they have a home for that, but also us who are working before the mechanism, to be quite clear and begin to imagine together what that dispensation, should look like, because the reforms are going ahead. In order to be able to do this, we have to develop a shared understanding of how social change comes about and an understanding of what is possible. So at the end of today's presentation, we would like to co-create a response, a resistance based on an understood need. And we are going to ask you, a civil society, to engage with this process and to help us preempt and counter what sometimes thwarts our efforts to work together as civil society. And ultimately, we would like to ask you to give us the various gifts in terms of what you are able to provide in taking this conversation forward. What we would like to ask you is to help us engage with this limited period that we have before the African Union make a decision around the reforms. We cannot do this, alone. As civil society, you are here because you are invested in the process. More than anything else, it's really an ask and urging you to help us do this work. So at the end of it, we are going to propose a few strategies for taking this work forward, with the idea that you will be able to say and raise your hand up about the things that you will be able to provide in this process. We are lucky to have been joined by Dr. Miamingi, who is here to help us have this conversation and to provide much needed information about all of these questions that we need answers to. And so I am not very good with introducing people, because now I have lost the only thing. I had one job to introduce. Dr. Miamingi is the co-founder of Integrate Africa Advisory Services, a Pan-African consultancy firm headquartered in Johannesburg, South Africa. It offers bespoke advice, research, and contracting services in African Union laws and policies, peace and security, economic integration, and geopolitical maneuver to clients. IAS provides key players and decision makers with demand-driven, strategic, intelligible, and actionable political, legal, economic, and social cultural advice, power play analysis, studies, compliance, risk, benefits assessments, among other things. Dr. Miamingi is an international lawyer and human rights and governance expert who has spent the last 7 years working in the governmental, non-governmental, and academic sectors. He graduated from Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife, Osun State, Nigeria, and holds a Master's of Law and a Doctor's of Law from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Dr. Miamingi is from South Sudan. Dr. Miamingi, you are welcome, and thank you very much for making yourself available to help us have this conversation. I am now going to hand over to you to take us through the process. Thank you and welcome.
Oh, wow. No, thank you very much, Sibo, because if there is one thing that I know, it is that the colleagues who are at least that I have seen in the room are colleagues that have been in the system for quite a long time. And so it is going to be really a conversation. So I want to thank you so much for putting this together. And I want to thank colleagues for making time to have this conversation. I personally consider this conversation to be extremely important. A conversation for some reasons that I will allude to. But for veterans that are here of the African human rights system and of working within the AU system more broadly, I want to believe that this is going to be a conversation for us. So let me time myself before you realize that it is 6 p.m. and I'm still talking. So let me just make sure that I have my timer on. Okay. Now, good. So as already, and you have eloquently, I wish I could do it that way, outline the task that we have at hand as Africans and people interested in Africa and civil society working in the space. So I'm going to have a brief conversation on the AU reform and its implication for the African human rights system. And what I intend to do is briefly look at the rationale as stated by the African Union. And this rationale was put forward, as some of us will remember, in the ACSE report 2007. That's when the idea of trying to reform, just 5 years after the AU, put on the table, and the resurfaced in 2017. And again, of course, in the Mekele report and in the Kagame report. And so we will look at what these processes so far says are the rational, and look at the document. It emphasizes issues of the need for effectiveness of the African Union system and for the system to operate efficiently. We will look at that and unpack what is it that the leaders have in mind when they talk about effectiveness and efficiency, and whether that's the same story that we share. And then we will take a bit of, we'll look briefly, as time will allow, at the current proposal that have been put forward. Proposals, whether in the ACSE report, in the Mekele report, in the Kagame report, and how far they have been able to implement this, and what is emerging from the practice so far. The issues that we see now really just doing with institutional realignment and refocusing of the union. And we will try and see what that says. And of course, we then look at the topic for which we have today, which is what is the implication of this, the rationalization of those reform, the current practice on the African human rights system. And what are the proposals that are there? We will look at the 3 proposals that are on the table. proposal around enhancing the status quo, that is the different component of the human rights system, make them work better. We'll look at a proposal where they should be merged into one or two judicial structures. We will look at proposals where the questions are around consolidation of the system, and see what are some of the positives and the negatives of this. And at the end of it, probably I will offer some of my own reflections and take away from there. So then let's, I hope this is, I hope I can move on. Okay. Can I control this? All right, good. Okay. Now, in terms of rationale for reform, the reports that I've cited, whether it is the DDG report or the Makelo report or the Kagame report, the narrative that makes reform a prerequisite is that the African Union as conceived and crafted and operating now is involved in multiple areas of engagement. And because it is involved in doing so many things, the union lacks focus, and therefore it is limited resources are not used effectively. That's the first rationale for the AU reform. So it is ensuring that we narrow the focus of the organization and use resources we have efficiently. Now, the second reason stated in these papers has to do with the fact that the AU has a very complex structure. And because of the complexity of that structure, there is a need to realign this structure if the African Union is going to deliver on its mission of an Africa we want and an Africa we deserve. And so, in other words, there, in addition to refocusing, the reform will have to look at a structural realignment. And the third reason for reform that is stated in these papers is that there is a disconnect between the union and the citizens. And we will all remember that one of the shift from the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, to the AU was the fact that while the OAU was state-centric, the AU was meant to be citizen-driven, citizen-centered. And the reform documents say this has not been achieved. And therefore, there's a need to rework the AU to make it citizen-focused, citizen-driven. And I think from all the rationale, this is where African citizens and the Friends of Africa and civil society working in and on Africa probably have an entry point in terms of narratives and in terms of the kind of conversation that need to go forward. Now, the fourth reason stated is that the African Union suffers from a dysfunctional political leadership and very poor management of the organs, including the African Union Commission. And therefore, something needs to be done if the other rationale and reasons have to be accomplished. And the final reason for reform is that Africa relies, and the African Union relies significantly on external funding. And as a result, the funding, availability of funding may not always be aligned with the African priorities. And therefore, there's a need to have processes in place. Now, those are the five rationale. And sometimes I ask myself and I wonder whether this is actually a proper diagnosis of the problem facing the African Union, or it is the narrative that those of us within the union are comfortable to tell ourselves. And let's take, for example, the conversation around structure. Now, the report places these data as affidavit why the African Union has complex structures. It says there are over 39 priority areas under Agenda 2063, and with goals and aspirations, so that is too many for the AU to manage. It also says that the AU has 9 organs, too many for the AU. It also says that the AU has high-level committees and subcommittees, and about 8 of them. And there are about 18 departments and offices. And of course, other directorates, about 4 of them. Specialized agencies, about 21 of them. And so this is seen as a very complex structure, and therefore makes the functioning of the institution that was set up to address continental integration, continental governing in a fast evolving geopolitical context. And you wonder whether the diagnosis of the problem is sufficient enough, or it is because we do not have appropriate diagnosis, that's why our solutions are where it is. I will leave that to you to make your judgment. Now, these are the reform proposals that are out there. Number 1 is that the African Union, the reformed African Union, should focus its energy and resources on few policy priorities, and only policy priorities that has continental focus and continental implications. By implication, the African Union should not involve itself in any programming of any nature. It should be a policy platform. The only exception is when it comes to issues to do with peace and security, because within the purview of conflict prevention, conflict management, and conflict resolution, there is the understanding that there may be some room for programming, at least within peace support operations. Other than that, it should be a forum for policy conversation, policy making, and policy coordination, policy oversight. That's one. That's a proposal. Number 2 is that there should be a clear division of labor. The union should have areas of competencies that it should operate on, and the regional economic community should also have their own clear areas of competencies. And of course, member states should have their own residual areas of competencies. And there are suggestions around how these competencies should be divided and or should be shared among the AU, regional economic communities, and member states. The third proposal is around review and optimization of structures. Now, as you would already have seen that at the African Union Commission, the result of this was the reduction of departments from 8 to 6, the merger of the Department of Political Affairs and that of Peace and Security, for example, into Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department. And now, of course, you would know that this is not the first time the the OAU and the African Union is doing this. There was a merger before, it didn't work, and then there was a divorce, and now there's a remarriage of these structures. And the emphasis on the structure is a bit, we should pay attention to it, because what we actually have seen within, at least where reform has taken place, is that it is about significantly reducing cost and not really so much about matching structures to mandates. Because one of the governing principles of this reform process is that it should not result in any additional $1 cost to member states. So the reform should be dollar-free. It should freeze at the current budget of the union, which is in the range of $700 to $900 million, and should not add additional cost to that. And I think we should keep that in mind. And of course, the issues around streamlining leadership. We've not seen that so much other than that reduction in commissioners. There's no significant movement in this area either. Now, there is the need to, let's say, undertake citizen-centered programs. So issues around free movement, African passports, and the like, so that a citizen can move freely, can interact, and contribute to and invest in the union. Of course, you already see that with the coming into force of the African free continental trade areas, seeing that with a push for visa-free travels on the continent. The passport itself has frozen somewhere else, but that is in the pipeline to make sure that goods, people, and services can move freely across the continent. And there is the emphasis in terms of proposal around how the African Union can have mechanism in place for effective decision-making, and implemented about 2,700 decisions of the Assembly, out of which maybe only 200 of them can be said to have been implemented. And so implementation problems and their reasons and suggestions for that, we might look at some of them later on. And finally, that there should be a merit-based recruitment and appointment system. Now, that was supposed to bring in organizations like the Deloitte and all those consulting companies to put in place a system that will result into deploying capable, qualified African citizens to manage the integration process of the continent. However, what we have seen emerging is, rather than a merit-based system, it is actually a merry-go-round system where member states have sat down, of course, rightly so, use the quota system, allocate numbers of positions to countries based on their contribution, and somehow that hasn't resulted. There's nothing wrong with quota system. You can still have a quota system that is merit-based. But what we are seeing, at least at the Commission, is not very, very encouraging, and in most of the recruitment that has happened. We have seen challenges, and we have seen complaints, and we have seen practices that are unethical emanating, and the overall result has actually been weakening of the system. Rather than reforming, I would argue, is deforming a number of the structures. But there are processes that has been put in the reform process. Now, those are the general problems that the reform. And now, with specific reference to the African human rights system, the proposals that are on the table, and some of them are not in the public domains. They should be in the public domain. They identify some of these as challenges that confront the African human rights system. Number one is that the system experiences overlap of mandates. So you have some protection mandate within the African Commission, protection mandate within the African Committee of Experts on the Right and Welfare of the Child, protection mandate residual with the African Court on Human and People's Rights. And that is seen as overlap of mandate. So also promotion mandate. And two of these three treaty bodies also receive reports. They have secretariats and so on and so forth. Now the overlap is argued to have resulted in unnecessary duplications of efforts, and that need to be addressed. There has been, but not so visible, mentioning of the fact that there is inadequate, but also inefficient use of resources that is available to the Commission, to the African human rights system. I give examples sometimes when I talk about the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, to say that for 2022, the program budget of the Commission was 198,000 United States dollars, not even 200,000, to be able to carry the work. And the result is that most of that money, almost 85,000 of it, was used for interpretation services. And that is the issues around inadequate, but also there has been cases of inefficient use of resources, where resources are just placed and used for running around the continent, from one workshop to the other, producing papers that find themselves on the shelves. And those have also been, and there is the problem of poor implementation of decisions and recommendations of some of all the treaty bodies within the African human rights system, whether they are judicial body or quasi-judicial bodies. And this has not been mentioned, but I've added it here because it has come out in conversation. There are questions around competencies of elected officials and recruited staff, either working at the political level or at technical level within the treaty bodies, but also some serious moral challenges where there are mismatch between the beliefs of some of these elected political officers or even recruited staff with the basic tenets of human right, rule of law, and democratic governance. And yet these individuals are supposed to, mandated to lead and provide thought leadership on these issues on continental scales. And there have been also the questions around political interference with how these entities can make decisions and which decision they cannot make, interference with what autonomy or independence actually mean, interference with appointments, appointing individuals with questionable qualification and character, interference in terms of resource and resource allocation. So there are a number of other issues that are there. And so these are some of the problems that the reform process is then supposed to address. And to address this, there are three proposals right now on the table. Some of these, my interpretation of the proposal as they are, and that they are not very far, having read the documents myself. So the interpretation may not be too far away from what in the document. So there are three propositions on what should happen, and the organs and entities are now meeting in Rwanda to discuss some of these proposals and for within the reform structure. The reform meeting that is called because there is a feeling that the reform is failing. So the first proposal on the table is what actually needs to happen in terms of improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of the current existing components of the African human rights system. So what some of this system have proposed is that for this to happen, number one, that this system, the treaty body should have full-time bureaus made up of chair and vice chairs who work full-time like those at the African Court on Human and People's Rights, number one. Number two, there are muted proposals here and there that the African Union should set up a voluntary human rights fund where countries and organizations that want to support human rights mandate on this continent can put resources in it, resources that human rights bodies can use to do work should the money allocated to them by member states not be sufficient to carry their work. There has been muted conversations. I don't know if they have made their way finally in Kigali around the questions of vetting system for candidates interested in becoming elected officials in the African human rights system. And there has been conversation, at least within civil society, around this. I might revisit this later on if there's an interest in it. And there are the issues that it is incomprehensible that some of these African human rights system, mechanisms, for example, the court, the commission and the committee, having 11 elected officials who themselves are commissioners or experts, and at the same time, special mechanisms as thematic mechanism, country rapporteurs, and doing almost everything. And so there are conversations around mirroring what happens within the UN to be able to bring in maybe some independent expertise and people who can operate and speak their mind without favor or fear on the issues that matter to this continent. And so there are some suggestions around this. But also that there's a need for a new structure for the secretariats, of course, to be able to then carry out and support this mandate. My feeling is this likely not going to be the preferred proposal, as long as some member states with voting powers, and everybody has a voting power, but might not be the best from their perspective. Now, the second is issues of consolidation. This was mentioned partly in the DDG report. It was raised in the Kagame report, and has been raised by, is it Deliot, that is doing the actual reform processes, proposing and doing audit and making recommendation. That the union should really operate and mirror what happens at national level. That is, there should be the executive, the legislature, which is the Pan-African Parliament, and the judicial bodies. So all the structures that work on the issue, whether they are quasi-judicial or judicial body, should be collapsed into one judicial entity. That is the first proposal, so that the commission, committee, and the court can all be consolidated into one entity. And that entity can then represent the judicial arm of the union. In doing that, you could increase number of elected officials and secretariat staff, and then integrate mandates of these treaty bodies into cross-cutting issues. So rather than specialized issues, the idea is they should deal with the issues that affect all. So if there are cases for children, of course, they will look at it. Women, of course, they will look at it. But they will look at that on case-to-case basis. That is the proposal. It might be the preferred proposal. I don't know. I'm not a member state. And there has been some submissions, one that there should be realignment of mandates, that is realigning within the system. So leave promotion to quasi-judicial bodies, and take protection to the court, so that you do not need to waste time adjudicating before a quasi-judicial body, and then that quasi-judicial body then move on to the court for enforcement. I just have it there with the court. And that if this was to happen, that then Article 34(6) need to be looked at, so that access is broadened to this judicial body. And then move all the mandates to do with civil society organization to ECOSOC. So observer status, criteria for granting observer status within the union. Sorry, I just want to check my time. Within the union should all be there. So if you want to approach, advise, engage, ECOSOC is your entry point there. So those are a snapshot of the conversation that are taking place with respect to what may or eventually may not happen within the system. I really don't think that they are all bad in terms of if intentions were good, because there are some positives to some of these proposals. Of course, number one is that some of this proposal could really enhance coordination and collaboration within the African human rights system. They could also streamline communication. And I think that now if you put together the program budget of the committee, of the court, and of the commission, they are within the range of $3 million. So maybe if that $3 million was in the hand of one entity, and they might use it more effectively or so efficiently. So somewhere, some of these might result in efficient use of limited resources. They will also might improve reporting. As you know, right now, state parties, report to the commission, they report to the committee, they report to the UN bodies, they report to, they submit some reports to the APRM mechanism. There are reports under the structural vulnerability assessment. There are reports anticipated under the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. And so there are so many of them. And so maybe some consolidation might reduce the reporting burden on states, but also on civil society that engage with those mechanisms. But there are serious shortcomings. Now, if you consolidate some of these bodies, the reason why there was the argument to have specialized bodies like dealing with children was that some of these issues required specialization. If you consolidate, you might find yourself actually eroding the ability to specialize. Already within these entities, even where they're operating, there are bureaucratic nightmares. To get one thing through some of these treaty bodies is a nightmare. Now imagine bringing all those into one place. The kind of bureaucratic challenges you'll get through to even get things to be considered, whether they are women's rights, their children's rights, disability, whether it should be considered by this particular subcommittee or that particular chamber or these. There could be serious bureaucratic challenges that will exacerbate what we already see in the system. But there could also be issues to do with conflicting mandates. And so you bring all this together, and depending on the dynamics within this one single body, some issues might get traction, others will fall through the tracks. And the kind of mandate already, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, probably one of the few treaty bodies with the widest possible mandate in the world. It can consider just about anything to do with human rights, whether first generation human rights, second generation human rights, third generation human rights, or emerging fourth generation human rights. They have mandate to deal with all this, including international treaties they can draw inspirations from, and they want to do that with $198,000. And so and you now consolidate all this into one. And then you bring children, you bring women, people with disabilities, social security. I mean, the AU has about 37 treaties or so with direct human rights implications, and you give all those mandates, including Kampala Convention and all those to one body. Even if you are to expand the number of commissioners from 11 to, let's say, even 33, there will still be so much work to do that it might not achieve the purpose for which it was intended. And so I want to spend the remaining few minutes on some of my concerns. They are my concerns. There may be concerns that you share. There may be more concerns that you share than this. There may be concerns that I share that I can't put in the public digest. But these are the few ones I'm comfortable to discuss. I worry that the driving force for the reform, especially with respect to the African human rights system, may not all be in good faith. And my reasons for this fear is when I look at the countries that are spearheading the reform processes and the agenda that might be behind this leadership in terms. First, some of these countries are not so human rights friendly and have not been friendly towards the African human rights system as such. And they are in the driving seat for this. And some of the decisions that have been made and some of the conversation that has been made lay some credence to this. But I'm also worried that the cost reduction so so let me just finish this, then we can take a break. Let me just, because there's only one slide after this. One is that the cost reduction motive that is driving the reform, and seeing what has happened at the commission in Addis, the African Union Commission, is actually, rather than reforming, is deforming an already malforming system or malfunctioning system. Because you cannot, in one breath, say that don't take money from external sources to do your work, but at the same time saying that you want to reform without contributing a cent to that reform. And thirdly, not being able to pay your due to the union to have the money to do the work. It is the same thing as saying, don't work. And that is my concern, that really the reform process might be desired to lead to some kind of defunding of this. And the other reason is, you see, I don't have a problem with the McKinsey, the Daily or all these other management consulting companies. I am not so sure whether human rights is really their core mandate. These accounting companies and management companies that are leading this process, their expertise and their toolbox are geared slightly different to where this. And finally, it appears to me that when it comes to the African human rights system, the driving force, mainly political, and the outcome expected are outcomes that are politically convenient. So I will stop here. I have only one more slide left. And maybe so that people can take some breath, and then maybe 5 minutes if people want to stretch or do something, and then I'll take my last slide which should be another 2-3 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Remember. Excellent presentation so far. Hello, all participants. While Dr. Remember catches his breath, would like to have your reflections on the presentation so far. And so my colleagues will put up a reflection question, which will be asking you to share your initial thoughts based on what you have heard so far on what you think CSOs should be doing to engage with this reform process. You can either do it through the chat box or you can raise your hands up to make a contribution. Thank you. We have 5 minutes for this exercise. All right, so we can resume now, but before Dr. Remember resumes the presentation, we have received a few questions and reflections. The first one says, does the current quota system of employment recognize gender? And there's another one, the suggestion under the reform to use HR firms. Will they be checking the firms for merit, whether these firms merit the assignments they've been given? And I think this has been raised as well by Dr. Remember. So such that these firms will not be employing their own personal persons, and that the employment would ensure employment equality of nationals according to percentage of the countries. There's also a contribution which is saying we need to rethink why we need civil society engagement with the African Union reforms in light of the global multilateral issues. And then asks a question whether there's a viable entity or entities that can engage on behalf of CSOs with this process. And then lastly, is a narrow or thematic focus on reforms sufficient, such as the focus on human rights mechanisms? Or do we focus on the entirety of reforms, as we know that human rights mechanisms will likely be placed within the political structures of decision-making when we might benefit from them enjoying functional and political independence? So these questions will be posed to Dr. Remember as he rounds up his presentation. And then after that, we can also have reflections from the rest of us. Thank you. So I'll hand over back to Dr. Remember.
Thank you very much, Dario. And yes, I will just respond to those one quickly. One of the things that credit should be given to the AU is that within the merit-based recruitment system, there are inbuilt requirements that are gender-friendly and gender-sensitive that reinforced the initial effort by Madam Zuma to drive through the gender parity within the union. And so it goes from shortlisting processes that require that certain percentage should already be given to people by virtue of age, if you're under 35, and by virtue of gender, certain score should already be given so as to provide an advantage. Additional to that is the requirement that within a shortlisting, at least 35% of the shortlisted candidate should be women. That is not gender, is women specific. And then youth, young people. And then that is long shortlisting, short listing, and the final three candidates that go for final interview, also their requirement for gender inbuilt in this. Now, that is the system. The practice might be slightly different for a number of reasons. So recruitment, of course, is done at technical level. Appointment is done at political level. And sometimes what happens at the technical level, and candidates that might have been recommended at the technical level may not be those that are appointed at political level. And so these are intergovernmental processes. So I think, yeah, we should, there is an effort, at least, in that regard. Whether it is prudent to just look at the African human rights system or the reform as a whole. I wish that this conversation had taken place 2 years ago. The fact is actually that the reform within the commission is done. What is now remaining is implementation of those. So the second and the final phase of the reform process is the African human rights system. And that's what we're talking about it. Because that is what is going right now. The companies that are doing this reform have already started consultations with the commission, the court, and the organs to get submissions. And they have their own proposals. The reform unit have its own proposals. So already the process, even for the African human rights system, is an advanced stage, but it's not late. And so that is why the conversation is narrowed to what is happening now. That might provide an opportunity for engagement, but also because these organs really provide an opportunity for civil society organizations to engage and to impact positively on the life of Africans on the ground. And so they are very important. And so it is not either or, it's just a timing issue that narrowed the conversation here. Are there civil society platforms that civil society should engage with? I think that, as I alluded to, the consultation, even with the staff, even with the organ, has really been inadequate, ad hoc, and based sometimes on predetermined assumptions. And so there's not been systematic, organized, in my knowledge, and in my opinion, of civil society platforms either operating within the invited spaces like ECOSOC or invented spaces that civil society invent for themselves as legitimate stakeholders in Africa's integration and is in relationship with the world to put their issues across and to engage with this process. And there are liaison offices in Addis that are thematic, children, Save the Children, Plan International, UNICEF. There are a few that are cross-cutting, like Oxfam. These liaison offices used to work very effectively in time past. Some of them are trying right now, but for a variety of reasons. One being, of course, funding, which is some of the unfortunate fact that while donors are throwing money at the African Union, money. I can't remember before I left the Union where, at least the department where I was, we used up to 34% of our budget. Just budget, not even the money that was put on the table for us. I mean, it was just by people, no proposal. People just pop up and say, we have money for you. But when it comes to civil society organizations, they need to hold this entity to account. Civil society funding, even when I used to do proposal writing for civil society organization, and that process is tedious. The availability of resources declining. And for sometimes good reasons, because you have to prove result, and sometimes engaging the union, some of the things that matter may not be measured easily. And so it's difficult to fit within the parameters that donors. So funding has been some problem that has forced some of these organizations to scale down to just maintain their presence. But it's also very difficult for just 2-3 people at a liaison office to engage with an entire moving structure across the continent effectively and efficiently. And so I hope that as part of this conversation, that maybe there will be some ways, not just with the reform, but to rejuvenate the conversation around as African civil society platforms and movement, because the African Union is too important to be left to governments alone. When we do not recognize its importance, countries have recognized this importance, and they're throwing money at the union. And that money comes with their agendas. As we see some kind of scale back from what you will refer to as progressive countries, if you are looking within the human rights paradigm, we are seeing more forceful presence and intervention from some country others might call a bit not so progressive with respect to human rights. And each of them come with their agenda. And so we as civil society organization, as Africans, if we do not step up and occupy this place, others will step up and they will use it for different reasons, and our work ourselves will be complicated. I think for me, this there is need for a new narrative around engaging with the African Union. Yes, there should be all the new narrative, in my opinion. Just as it is with any other multilateral system and intergovernmental platforms, I think that there are lessons to learn and how to engage with us. I hope I attended to the questions, and let me take my last slide. I mean, somebody said that if you're not on the table, you might be on the menu. And maybe some of your issues might actually be on the table itself in the plate. It is my view, and having been around the African Union from 2008, either heading a liaison office to the union or working within the union itself, that civil society engagement with the union has not been consistent, coherent, and sufficiently enough to claim spaces that rightfully belongs to us as citizens on this continent, or even as a global citizen. And the result then being that the decisions are taken on behalf of civil society organizations and citizens that might not always be in their interest. And I hope that as part of this conversation and the other conversation, that African citizen and civil society organization will re-energize, recraft, revitalize their engagement with the union, not as people who are looking for access to drive, but as rightful owners, at least as citizens. Our government still pay some of because right now the union only pay salaries, partners pay for programs. So even the salaries of these people are paid by taxpayers. At least we should have some right on how people we employ work for us and on our behalf. It is my belief that there is a need for reform, definitely. But I am not so sure that this current reform process will address that need. What I see is that as with any reform, it provides opportunities for progress or regression. It depends on the people who are on the table. If civil societies are not on the table and the issues of African citizens are not on the table, member state issues will be on the table, whether they're in Africa, in Asia, or in the West, wherever they are, their issues will be on the table. And the result might not just affect us directly, the work that we do, but indirectly. I hope that civil society organization will be able, at least within this narrow focus, to be able to put together and push through some kind of a principle-driven reform processes. Principle-driven reform processes that identify what should be the principle that should underpin this reform, but also put some effort into addressing the questions of resourcing, especially human resource. Those who have engaged with the treaty bodies within the system will note, unfortunately, in some cases, retrogressive positions and posturing, sometimes deliberate, sometimes really driven by very ignorant people who've just had a political vote. And if we do not address the quality and the competencies and the moral standard of people who find themselves in places that manage our integration issues and our common agenda and our destinies, we will then have given ourselves the work to continue to shout outside the fence, and with people inside the fence and on the table without shouting falling on their deaf ears. I pray that and I hope that civil society engagement will be to reduce the political interference that is really on the rise, and again, driven by the bold support that some of these countries get from some part of the globe, and resources and money that is coming from there, and narratives around what kind of human rights should be very important and which one are not human rights, and that the outcome process will not be so politically convenient. At least that if we can emphasize on this and do some work around it, history and posterity will remember us for what we did. Thank you very much for your time, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Remember, for the presentation. Some of us have been really educated here. There are two questions that have been raised on the Zoom question and answer function. The first one is from Edmund Foley, and it says, brilliant presentation, but asks, are we likely to get some direction from the upcoming meeting of the PRC in Kigali on these reform proposals? I ask because the rumor mill also has it that no decision will be taken anytime soon. The second question is, how has the AU ensured formal inclusion of CSO's recommendations in the reform process? And perhaps before you answer that, I also want to let participants know that they can ask questions either using the question and answer function, the chat box, or by raising their hands up to ask a question live. But perhaps I should add one question of my own for both Dr. Remember and the participants. Remember, I've spoken about how CSOs shouldn't be talking outside the fence. But then in the absence of CSO voices at platforms such as the PRC, how can CSOs have a voice in the processes and in the outcomes of these reform processes, especially as it affects the human rights mechanisms? Thank you. Let me see if we have participants raising their hands. Okay, there's Damon Wamara. Could you please give Damon Wamara the floor? Please unmute yourself, Damon, and you can hear.
Thank you, Dar. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you also for bringing the presentation to us and the conversation and opening the space for us to have this conversation. I joined a bit late, but I managed to catch up with much of what Doctor was presenting. And I think key conversations or key points he brought out, I think need to be tackled in the sense of how do we then engage? I heard Doctor saying we need to be strategic and engage, but then how then do we engage on the emerging issues? Key comment that you made, Doctor, is the composition of the persons leading on the reforms. Are they aware of the dynamics of human rights? Are they aware the gains that we have had? And is it a matter of just, like you said, is it about cutting costs and all that? But is it a matter of cutting costs versus what you raised earlier on, versus the people benefiting and gaining? And for me, those are conversations I would initially want to engage with the consultants to find out what is their rationale and what is their thinking. Is it only financial saving, or is it also social saving that we are looking at? And for me, I think then the conversation and the dynamics runs into how do we then get people not only to look at the financial saving, but the social inclusion, and ensure that the reforms are actually going to not only be relevant for the economic growth and development, but also for the social enhancement and strengthening livelihood in our continent. And for me, those are the key questions I throw to Doctor. How can we then engage? And yes, I know there's eco space and all that, but those are some limited spaces. How do we then engage? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damon. There's another question that has been raised in the question and answer platform. It says, at what stage are CSOs engaged in these reforms, taking into account they are the major players? This is from Petronella Kangu. Are there any other hands up to ask questions? I see none at this stage. Perhaps we give Dr. Remember the floor to address those that have been asked already while we take more questions after. Dr. Remember, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much for these very difficult questions. And there are people here who are veterans in this conversation. Anything that I haven't maybe not alluded to, colleagues, please, it is a conversation, it's a family conversation. And so I think it will be important that we bring it on the table. Is there any possibility that a decision will emanate from Kigali? That question reminded me when I was in Addis at the commission. Some departments say, this reform is not going anywhere. It will be paralyzed. There will be no decision. Nothing will happen until they were shocked by assembly decision. And those departments today are some of the victims of inaction because of pessimism, because of rumor mill that were going around, and because people just didn't think that, African member state will be so insensitive. But it did happen. So I don't know whether something is going to come out from Kigali. Nothing is really significant supposed to come out from Kigali. Kigali is supposed to prepare a ground for the media conversation, and then for January and February summit. And anything can happen between now and there. So we watch the space in Kigali, but let's be as pessimistic, but also as proactive as we can, just in case. That is about the issues around Kigali. Now, formal mechanisms for engagement, and that question is around how can civil society engage with this process. For me, the first is those of us who come from countries that have a voice, a space, and issues to present on the table. Because I say this, because there are countries, there are member states of the Union who, for the time I was there, never rose their flag to say anything. And we know that some of these members, actually, even their membership fees are paid by countries outside this continent. I will not name them. And so they occupy spaces. But there are countries that put on the table significant money into the union. And some of these countries claim to be progressive, pro-human rights. They are democratic. I think our engagement should start from home front. Those in South Africa can begin, for example, to engage with the South African government. Those in Kenya can begin to engage with the Kenyan government. Those in Rwanda can begin to engage with the Rwandan government. Those in Nigeria can begin to engage with the Nigerian government and provide to the capitals messaging and position that will find its way into Addis and eventually will find its way on the floor. Because we have few countries that do their research very well, and sometimes these countries' research is not meant to advance human rights usually, but they are vocal, they sound convincing about it, and some countries just play it around. So for me, the starting point is where we pay our taxes, where we have access and right as citizens, we should make our voice known and organized at that level. But also then we know the actors. There is a reform unit that is set up, that is managed by this professor from Cameroon and his own staff. There his emails to receive input and proposals. And we have seen even individuals actually who wrote proposals and send it to some of those reform units. And people sometimes are too busy or too lazy. And these things are just taken and pasted. And some of governments really, you want to hide something from them, put it in writing. And some of this has been adopted as decisions. And so we can engage with the reform unit, have a very articulated position and present it to them and push through with us. I think they provide another avenue. And this company, those of Deloitte and that are, working on these issues, they operate in our country, so we know people there. I'm sure that some recent pieces will also make their work easier for them. And we have seen civil society organizations who actually have drafted documents and speeches and give them to countries in Addis, and these countries sit and talk as if it is theirs. But already your language, your voice are on the table, even though you might not be there visibly on the table. And so I think we need to be innovative, we need to be creative, and we could use all these mechanisms, including ECOSOC. ECOSOC has a proposal on its reform processes, the ECOSOC structures are there. It's also some of the way that I think we can tangibly, and I don't think we should do, it's not either or. We probably should engage across spectrum from national level through to the commission in Addis, the African Union Commission, where the reform unit is seated, to the organs themselves that are making proposal. If you want certain things to be done at the commission, direct, because they are also pulling their own proposal together as organs, and to the consulting companies that are doing this thing. I think we should engage with them, but also some of the donors. Some of these donors also have leverage and influence, and engaging with them, I mean, it could provide another opportunity for some of this messaging to find its way in places we may not necessarily be there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Remember, the questions keep coming in, but I would like to encourage us that as we send in questions, we should also make suggestions on how you think CSOs and others should engage on these issues. There's a hand up, but before I give the floor to Ikechukwu, there are a few questions on the Zoom platform. One says, I didn't really understand one aspect of the reform. Can you clarify for me the legal and human rights aspects of the reform? And then there's another one that says, it is not safe to say that the proposals will take long to implement. If and does, the day will come sooner or later that they'll be put into practice, and it may be too late to influence anything. Then I think that's a contribution. And then another one says, is it worth someone giving an overview of how CSOs have been engaged up to now and what has worked and not worked up to now? Another question says, back to the imminence of the AU formally adopting these reforms. How imminent is this? Dr. Miamingi mentioned the January or February summit. Is it likely to happen then? If so, at the very least, we as CSOs may try to delay the process and insist that the draft report or recommendations be made available for a process allowing comments and discussion by African citizens, including CSOs, before these are officially tabled by the AU Assembly. That's from Professor Franz Fillon. And the last one says, we cannot talk of AU reform without addressing the structural, okay, this is not so clear. Brenda Madumise, if you could please retype that to let us know what exactly you wanted to pass across. So I would ask that we give Ikechukwu Uzoma the floor. Please, Ikechukwu, make your contributions straight to the point, and please introduce yourself as you start. Can we please give Ikechukwu the floor? Please unmute yourself and proceed.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Dio. And hello, everyone. My name is Ikechukwu Uzoma, and I work for the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. Thank you so much, Dr. Remember, for the presentation. And thanks, everyone, for this space. I think that in terms of how civil society engages on this issue, I think we should have a short-term and a mid to long-term approach or plan. As Sibongile said at the top of this webinar, you know, this process has gone on for 7 years, and the fact that we may not have been able to engage and have an impact on the process is reflective of the fact that we need, you know, to rethink how we respond to issues generally as civil society on the continent, and what the platforms are to promote that level of engagement. So I think in terms of long-term planning, that finding some structure for coordination will be critical, and it has to be one that, you know, everyone on this call and everyone who really has the interest of the human rights system on the continent at heart would have to support wholeheartedly. In terms of the short-term plan, I think whatever needs to happen is to happen between now and January, when you know, at least the next summit is, because there's a potential that something happens between now and then. Maybe it also doesn't happen, but at least in the short term, we should have a plan. And some of the points I wanted to raise, Dr. Remember just raised as he answered the last set of questions. I think we should make the engagement of state parties around this, you know, the ratification of these reforms. I think we should make it politically, you know, we should make it politically costly. We should, I think one of our greatest strengths as civil society is our proximity with electorates, our proximity with the citizens. Even sometimes civil society is closer to the citizens than governments are. So what can we do between now and then to make this an issue that every, as I make this suggestion, I get pushback within myself. But what can we do to make sure that state parties are not hearing this just from civil society, but they are hearing this from citizens, to the extent that they engage with citizens? How can we ensure that, you know, this is an issue that the local media in these countries are concerned about? If elections are coming up, how can we make sure that these are important issues, you know, to be raised in the context of elections? How can we make this politically relevant domestically? And not just because, you know, the consideration of civil society as being opposed to government could, in the short term, limit the extent to which we can change the attitude of state parties. But even beyond that, a mapping of how state parties already align around this is important. Because if we do find that there's a critical mass that may not necessarily be interested, or that may not be agreeable to how this process has been carried on, then we may have greater power to even engage them directly and not go, you know, the route that I suggested earlier. But then in terms of the long-term plan, in addition to coordination, we also need to understand further how to engage more directly with the political side of things. As more human rights organizations, we have to pay attention to the political side of things and make sure that, you know, we can track some of these processes when they begin and be able to feed into them as early as possible. I'll stop at this for now. Thanks, Lion.
Thank you, Ikechukwu. Before I give the floor to Dr. Remember, a number of important questions has been raised. So the last contribution on the Zoom says we cannot talk of AU reforms without addressing the structural challenges and reforms in African countries. I think that's a suggestion as well. But I'd like to add a question for Remember. And you've mentioned a number of structures that we can engage, both at the local level and also at the African Union Commission in Addis. Apart from those, are there other AU structures that have a role to play and that we can influence? And how would you suggest civil society engage with these structures? So I'll give you the floor, Dr. Remember.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Again, as I said, we are all here, Prof. Edmond, Sibongile, and everybody else that are here. Please, let's chip in because some of these questions are very, very important. I'm not very clear in my mind, the question around what is the legal implication of the research, maybe, I mean, of the reform. Maybe I'll come to that later on. Let's just in a minute, maybe provide a bit of an overview of civil society engagements, at least to the extent to which that is that I'm familiar with. All right, we've had a robust civil society engagement around the African Union processes that can date back to around 2007. That's when at least my direct knowledge will take me. And one of those platforms, for example, was the African Union Citizen Platform that was convened by Oxfam and by other organizations. It was what Moyo will refer to as an invented space. It was space invented by civil society. They met before every summit as ECOSOC was having its own conversation. They discussed the issues that were on the agenda of the summit. They had conclusions, and each of them tasked themselves to engage with different countries where they come from, different delegates to push their issues through. It was a very effective, very efficient platform based on the different evaluations that were undertaken. Civil society, competition, dwindling resources weakened that platform. And I don't know if it is meeting again. The second level of engagement has been mainly thematic engagement. Children right organization dealing with children right issues and organize themselves into the CSO forum around the committee, the NGOs around the commission, and the Coalition for an Effective Court around the court. And from time to time, they converge where summits are to discuss the issues, side events, and all that, and engage indirectly. So some of these thematic platforms also have liaison offices in Addis, as I alluded to earlier on. And so there's some engagement that's taking place there. There are also civil society that's providing significant technical support to different components of the African human rights system. For example, the Commission, and we can put the Institute, the Center for Human Rights, and a number of others that are playing very significant role within the systems in terms of capacity, in terms of technical support, that also will also provide opportunity for some form of informing and influencing processes within this. So there are engagement that are going on at that level. There are civil society who understand the behind the scene advocacy that works within the union sometimes, the work behind the scene, the draft papers for member state they provide. So they are not in the PRC, but at least you can hear their voices come through member states there. So there are a number of scattered engagement that are going there. but they might not be as systematic, institutionalized, inclusive, and resourced as it should be. It is a challenge, but it's something that can be looked at. I'm hoping that. So likelihood, again, the question around what is the likelihood? We don't know. If you ask people today in Addis, even if you ask the chairperson of the African Union Commission whether this is going to be adopted in January or not, he doesn't know, because it takes some countries with vested interest to table some of this conversation. And as you know, and I've argued that the African Union really has not evolved into a multilateral platform, which is a collective will of the constituent elements. It is a multi-bilateral platform where different bilateral units of member states, depending on shared interests, can carry the entire process. We saw it with the ICC, where 4 or 5 countries can carry the entire union because they have interest there. With this reform, it takes few countries. Countries today, you can almost know who are driving the current reform process. These are countries that are at conflict internally, and that conflict is putting them at loggerhead with countries that are pushing human rights narratives, or countries that come with some cultural or religious fundamental views and therefore want to use this as an ideological issue, or countries that at home believe they're suffering from the side effect of extreme liberalism, and they cannot face that again at the continental level, and they use the continental level as a shield for their responsibility at domestic level. So we know those countries, and we know those that we can engage with as civil society organization. And so we should be strategic in engaging with those, because we don't know how this process can go. I want to believe that if it was possible, the proposal around delaying the reform process will be viable. And I mean, there are countries, and I will use South Africa here, where there are constitutional processes that require a certain level of consultation, where there are judicial processes that mandate the executive to act in certain ways on issues of collective representation outside. That provides an opportunity. And for a country like that, putting $45 million annually into of taxpayers' money into these, at least for them to have consultation, the minimum at national level, so that what they are presenting in Addis is a national position. They are not a position of 1 or 2 or 3 individuals. And so if there are mechanisms to look at delaying the process and creating a further opportunity for people to engage with the process, I think it is possible. If not, then let's see what we can do with what we have at hand. Yes, I think that we can engage with, the commission, for example. All the organs are now at edge, because the proposal of merger means some of them will lose their jobs. Right? So they are also interested for survival. And so they're also open to ideas, whether it is a committee, it is a court, it is ECOSOC, all these organs. They're open to ideas, to be able to ideas that also safeguard their own interests, but ideas that can safeguard some of the core functions of these entities. So let's engage with the subject of these reforms. Let's engage with those that are engaging with the reforms. Let's engage with the companies that are managing the reform processes. Let's engage with our friends within the union, within the commission, who can give information as they come in, because information is more or less like almost every information at the AU is top secret. It's like classified by default, not because people want to. But if you have people there, you have access to information, you can be proactive. So I think we can engage with all those platforms. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Remember, we have come up with some excellent suggestions and recommendations on how to proceed. So I'd like to hand over to my colleagues, May Aman and Lloyd Kuvea, to take the discussion forward with a collection of strategies that have been raised here. Thank you. May and Lloyd, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Sibongile Dayo, the team working in the background, and Dr. Miamingi for really taking us through this important conversation. So we are going to present in terms of strategy, but I like the fact that already Dr. Miamingi and Dayo had started that process. So we are just going to sort of round off in a way. So May will start, and she'll be looking at, I think people are concerned about the timelines, you know, of what is happening. And also she will look at the aspect of, you know, research, development of knowledge, and how we are going to disseminate that. And finally, she will also then look at the issue of stakeholder engagement, and I'll just finalize with how we engage states going forward as part of the strategy. Thank you. Over to you, May.
Thank you so much, Lloyd and Dayo. So our strategy session will be brief, concise, and we will try and summarize the proposed strategies and activities from our side and the ones that have been proposed by the audience. So to start off, we have identified the important timelines of relevance to the discussion at hand. And the first one is the AU Summit in June, which has already commenced. Dr. Remember has referred to it in the Q&A section. And we think the issue might be raised and discussed, but like Dr. Remember has said, we just need to monitor the outcome, as well as to become proactive to it. The second timeline is the January-February 2024, where the PRC needs to adopt the report on the AU reform. So these are the timelines that we are working with, and that we need to take action. As to the strategies, we identified 3 proposed strategies, activities, very broadly speaking. The first one is knowledge production and dissemination. And this strategy requires organizations to engage in the production and dissemination of accurate and comprehensive knowledge on the implication of the proposed African Union reforms on the African human rights system. And this will include conducting research, analysis, and impact assessments to identify potential risks and opportunities, as well as to produce knowledge products. And this is to ensure that knowledge is shared widely through reports, policy briefs, fact sheets, and any other accessible formats. And this will ensure that policymakers, civil society organizations, and the public are well informed. Lastly, it includes the development of evidence-based arguments and information. And moving on to the civil society engagement part of the strategy, it involves engagement in meaningful and inclusive consultations, as well as dialogues with diverse range of civil society organizations, human rights defenders, as well as grassroots activists. Some of the areas that fall under this strategy are identifying individuals, networks, and institutions that might be interested in the issue, facilitating platforms for dialogue, such as roundtable discussions, workshops, webinars. And this is also to foster collaboration, share experience, and identify common strategies, as well as to decide on how civil society will take this issue forward and how it will organize itself when it comes to this issue. Another point that falls under this strategy is to clarify the asks of what civil society would like to see emerge from the reform process itself. We have taken note of the contribution made by the audience, Ekochoko's contribution, as well as Prof. Francis' contribution when it comes to the short-term and long-term approach and plan amongst civil society organizations, and the fact that civil society organizations should start working towards delaying the process and insisting and employing pressure that the report should be made available for discussion among civil society organizations, even citizens, before it is finally adopted. So this is just a brief on the strategy section when it comes to the knowledge management and civil society engagement. I hand over to Lloyd to take us through the final part of the strategy on state engagement.
Thank you very much, Mai. So I'll proceed now to just look at engagement of states. When Dr. Miamingi was speaking, I was hoping he was going to name some of these states, whether the rogue ones or the good ones, you know. Maybe it will be, I mean, we might engage you separately, but, you know, it would have been nice to know. But, I mean, having been active within the African human rights system, particularly at the Commission, one gets the impression that there are some of those problematic countries, you know, and also those are the countries perhaps who are going to drive these processes for political expediency. Countries like Egypt, for instance, Ethiopia, South Africa has been worrying, incrementally, so, I mean, despite what, the expectations from civil society that it should really be pro-human rights, sometimes also they prevaricate. So, South Africa also needs to be targeted. Then Algeria, of course, I mean, it's also been trying to influence processes at the Commission, especially. One country that is really problematic when it comes to the Commission, and I think which will sort of influence processes to sort of weaken the Commission is Botswana. That it seems like they still have a bone to chew with the Commission and its role. So, I mean, of course, there are other peripheral countries that have experience in dismantling things that are working, such as Zimbabwe. We know the history of Zimbabwe with the SADC tribunal. So it's another country to watch out for. I think then, I think the first step in terms of strategy is identifying some of the influential states that are driving the reform process. What are their motivations and how do we engage them? I think that is going to be critical. And then, of course, we need to identify who are the champions, who are really pro-human rights, who are concerned, who are committed to having an African human rights system that works, that is effective, that is efficient. I mean, we need also to understand the role of Rwanda. Okay, how genuine is Rwanda? I mean, given the fact that, they've withdrawn from the African Court, and then they want to be the champions of, Pan-African solutions and so on and so forth. So I think we need to then identify the motivations, the political, expediency that that is driving some of these countries really, before we start engaging them. So I agree with Dr. Miamingi that I think each of us as civil society or representatives here in this meeting should commit to engaging our states at the domestic level. Really, so come up with those position papers. We do our research, we develop the position papers, and we engage, the states so that we contribute to the process. Because again, to quote Dr. Miamingi, we don't want to be on the menu, on the plate. We want to be at the table. And one way of getting in is really engaging states at the domestic level. Then I think in terms of engaging states at some of their multilateral gatherings, I don't know how effective that is going to be. So at the summits, will civil society be able to travel to the AU summits and then perhaps start targeting? I don't know, that could be another strategy, targeting states that are attending the summit, whether individually or collectively. I don't know how that can be done. I mean, given, I think, the work that was done again by that citizens platform with the AU that was effective, which Dr. Miamingi again also referred to. So it's one other, area, but platform, I mean, of course, I mean, I think we should, with civil society engagements, we should also look at the engagement with the ECOSOC, so is that is going to be critical, because we understand that ECOSOC has already started, or I don't know, finalized the process of coming up with criteria for observer status. And from my understanding, ECOSOC claims to have consulted civil society, but also from my understanding, the civil society organizations consulted are those that are members of the assembly. So it's then going to be critical to see how we also make our contributions known, or we submit our contributions instead of in terms of criteria for observer status to ECOSOC. I think whilst we are in that process, how do we do it? I think it will obviously, I mean, those of us who have been doing advocacy, I mean, it's critical to just emphasize the fact of building relationships and identifying who are the people within the respective states who actually make the decisions, who are the influencers, and then we engage them and encourage them to adopt the right decisions and the right positions regarding these particular reforms. My just other issue is on the consultants. I think Dr. Miamingi mentioned the consultants. Is it Deloitte? We don't know. Is it Deloitte, or is it which other accounting firm is involved? And from which particular country? Is it Deloitte Ethiopia? Is it Deloitte South Africa? Where are these consultants based, so that we can also request that we need to be consulted in the whole process. And I think a lot of the questions that were raised by people in terms of strategy were responded to by Dr. Miamingi, and I don't want to then waste our time. I think we have captured those suggestions and recommendations in terms of strategy. And I would like to end there and hand over to Dayo again for conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lloyd and May, for helping us to collate those suggestions and important things that we need to be doing. Now, for us to round up, I would hand over the floor to my colleague, Varian Sika, to give the closing remarks. And yes, Varian, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Dayo, and thank you all for joining us today. It's been a long but instructive 2 hours. There's quite a few things to just remind us to mention about what we should do next, because that's what's most urgent. The convening organizations, which are IHRDA, ISLA, Synergìa, and ACSE, which is we'll share information about the conveners in a follow-up email to you all. We'll have also instructions on and information on what next steps we should be taking. And I just also want to thank very much Dr. Remember for the very enlightening presentation that you've shared with us, and to the participants, thank you for the very interesting questions and difficult questions that we need to be thinking about going forward. I just want to mention one thing about what happens next. We have a platform where we engage at the African Commission, which is the ACSE, which we'll share as well in follow-up emails. Please keep your eye out for information and communication from us with regards to what to do, as we can talk in person and engage in other ways on that platform. But for specifics with regard to this conversation, I would like to invite Sibongile to just tell us what's next with regards to dates and future discussions. And thank you all once again.
Thank you all very much. As we come to the end, I'm going to use this last 1.5 minutes left to say this is a call to action. We have gathered you here today because we are asking you to act, because what we do in the next 6 months determines a lot. We are inviting those who are interested, having heard what the proposed strategies are, to help us refine this and also to assume certain roles in terms of what you can do, help us to implement. We have mentioned 4 things. We want to engage with member states. We want to engage with civil society. We also want to engage with the committee that's also dealing with the reforms. And we want to be able to communicate kind of broadly. But these things are not going to be able to do this for themselves. As civil society, we know that we already have got our work plans, but we are increasingly being pushed to do firefighting work. And so, knowing what we know today, we are going to need all hands on deck to help us actually do this. So can you block the 26th of June, 4 p.m. SAST? We are going to send an email, but we would like those who would like to implement the strategies or have got other strategies to really help us engage with the reform process to make themselves available to do that. But beyond that, we would like to thank you all very much for your time, and hope that you will respond to the call to action and help us make use of the remaining 6 months. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all. Bye. Center for Human Rights is also one of the convening partners. I think we omitted mentioning them. Here is a poll to close us out. Are you interested in taking part in future strategies or activities? Thank you all very much.